Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm Tamsin Rosewell. I'm a bookseller and an illustrator, and I today am going to be chatting to Gabriela Houston, who is the author of The Wind Child and The Storm Child, both of which I actually loved. I picked up The Wind Child when it first came out, and Gabriela and I did a launch event, so it's really nice to be able to welcome her back to talk about book two, which is The Storm Child. But I hope we will be talking about both as a cycle, if you're not familiar with The Wind Child already. Gabriela, welcome. Really nice to see you again. I would like to do a reading so we know where we are and we know the way in which this book is written. But before we do that, can we just talk a little bit about your background and also my background reading this as a reader, as it were? So, we're talking about Polish Slavic folklore. We've got a cycle, which is a mythic folkloric cycle, but with actually quite sort of modern feeling characters. We've got two children, and the whole thing takes the form of a wonderful adventure story. I mean, it really is just a really exciting, very fast-paced adventure story. So talk to me a little bit about your background and where you're coming from in all of these books.
So I'm Polish. I have lived in the UK since I was 19. And I sort of came back to Slavic folklore and Slavic mythology as an adult. So these are stories that I used to read as a little kid, that my family used to read to me. And then I kind of moved away and got interested in other world mythologies, and only sort of came back to it and rediscovered it as an adult. And it's such a rich source of inspiration. And it was, living in the UK as well, it felt important to me to kind of go back to that and focus, the landscapes that I describe in the Wind Child and the Storm Child are both the landscapes that I remember from my childhood. And it was a kind of way of connecting my present to my past that felt meaningful for me. And it's also, when I started writing The Wind Child is about, childhood loneliness and childhood grief, and how we sort of learn to trust others and develop friendships. And in The Storm Child, I sort of took that aspect of sort of childhood and tried to add to it the concepts of identity and shifting identity and dual identity as well. So Mara, the main character of the Wind Child and Storm Child, is her mother is the daughter of Shibok, the god of winter winds, and her father is human. And she, the way she looks, she looks human through most of the Wind Child, and that affects how she sees herself and who she wants to be more like. And then at the end of the Wind Child, her human soul is stripped away from her as a result of something she does, and she suddenly looks like the wind spirit. She suddenly, like, her heritage of her mother's side sort of is brought forward in a very visible way, and she has to come to terms with that as well and sort of try and figure out who she is in that. And her best friend Tornev has a sort of dual identity, dual heritage as well. He is his father is of sort of Prisan heritage, which is the country that is roughly based on sort of 16th, 17th century Poland and Ukraine and Lithuania. And his mother, who he grew up without his mother, but his mother was of Botrysh origin, who are like a traveling community. And over the course of the Storm Child, he is trying to discover, he meets people from a Botrysh community, and how they respond to him sort of affects how he sees himself, and he has to sort of come to terms with that. And And the concept of dual identity is very interesting to me. You know, I have lived in the UK for half my life now, and you know, I recognize what an influence it's been on me, and of course, sort of going forward with my family as well, how it'll affect them. So, and you know, of course, coming from like a homogenous country like Poland, where virtually almost all people in Poland are just Polish. You know, they're all white. There's very few sort of communities that are not white Polish. You know, it was quite a step for me, you know, to come here and, you know, to come across people who have a dual identity, who are half Indian, half something else, who, you know, who are, you know, mixed race. And talking to my friends who have had that experience has been really interesting for me, because those sometimes also how we look doesn't actually represent our heritage. And
I know exactly what you mean, and I'd like to talk more about that sort of ambiguity of heritage as well as one of the themes, and also about the shape shifting, and I think those two are connected. Before we do a reading on this, you know, I certainly came to this as a reader also of very mixed heritage, but brought up in the UK. So I'm half Irish, half Anglo-Irish, and half Moroccan. And I'm not I don't feel particularly connected to either culture. Born and brought up in very central London. I know I have some Polish heritage, and the Slavic cycle of mythology and folklore was completely unfamiliar to me, which actually was a bit of a shock, you know, as someone who was aware of that fragment of my heritage and has an interest in folklore and mythology. I really didn't know this. I don't know the names. I don't know how to pronounce the names of these characters. They are really entirely unfamiliar to me. So I was really pleased to see that for this reason. And I'm also really conscious, you know, working in schools, you know, so much as a bookseller, that there's a lot of children who are often, you know, first, second, and even third generation mixed heritage. So I think my question to you about the retelling of these tales is actually how, you know, now we're all, so many of us, particularly on this little island, are so culturally mixed, of such mixed heritage, often mixed faith families as well. You know, how can we continue, how can we ensure that that folklore is still relevant? How can it be kept alive? Why is it important to keep retelling these old stories?
I mean, first of all, I think as a writer, one of the first and foremost, my job is also to entertain. You know, so before any kind of educating qualities of a book, the book has to entertain. Otherwise, it won't do any of the other stuff you want it to do. So, and for folklore and mythology, you know, wherever they're from, they are usually very compelling stories. You know, whichever mythology we're talking about, you know, whether it's Norse or Japanese or Ashanti, they're compelling stories because they have to be, because they are there originally to help organize society, to help build a community, the identity of a community, to introduce us to the rules for how to keep us safe, how to interact with each other. The stories try to explain the world that surrounds us, and you know, they are, you know, like we discussed before, mythologies are just religions that we don't practice anymore, and so we reserve our most compelling stories for our religion, and you know, having a glimpse into how people view the world is such a deeply enriching experience. And it doesn't have to be your own mythology. It doesn't have to be your parents' heritage or your grandparents' heritage. I think there is such tremendous value in reading mythologies from all over the world, because they help us to sort of figure out, like, and confront how we see other humans, how we see the natural world, and even, you know, being able to compare and contrast is very valuable.
And actually, so many of them can be read as familiar to, even if it's not a culture that we're from. I mean, we know how many flood stories there are in, across all world mythology and cultures, that it's very unlikely we're connected. A lot of these stories and the themes and the types of characters, the trickster character was one that I think is really interesting in the way you've worked it into the story, where the trickster himself gets tricked. We'll come back to look at that as well in a minute. Let's move on to talking about your stories, because we've got a situation here. When we open the Storm Child, which is the second book, we've left Mara in this really difficult position at the end of the Wind Child, with everyone thinking, oh no, there's another book, and here we are. So they are being followed, her and Tornev are being followed. They're in great danger. They're in a really, really difficult situation. Could we have a reading? So there was a particular moment early on in the book where they escape from the Homen. Perhaps you could explain who the Homen are, and then if you could do this little reading for us, that would be great.
So just to give a little background of what's happening, it's a year on from where we left off in the Wind Child. And both Mara and Tornev are on the run from Kosheva Deathless. Kosheva Deathless is a kind of, in mythology, is this extremely powerful wizard who cannot die because he has separated his soul from his body and he's hid it somewhere. Now, in the Wind Child, Mara finds his soul and she stole it. She first stole it at the behest of another god who was offering her a very one-sided bargain, as it turned out. But she holds on to the soul, and now Koshei is after her and Tornev, seeking to destroy them. And they basically try to use all the tricks available to them, knowing the rules of a sort of Slavic spirit world, to try and evade him. But he has many spies as well, and one of those spies is Homen. So Homen is basically a procession of the dead. It's kind of like a screeching, shouting, carriage riding, skeletons. That
it reminds me of the Wild Ride and the Wild Hunt that we have in other northern. We have a Wild Hunt, here in Warwickshire. There's a lot of stories of Wild Hunt, and also there was a Folklore Society lecture a few days ago about the Wild Ride of Denmark, which actually is a very similar thing. The imagery is really similar. This charging brigade of death that screeches across, really destroying all in its path.
I mean, you never know. They might have a common source somewhere. It's really interesting for me to discover, Slavic languages are from the family of Indo-European languages, for example. And my husband's family, who lives in Bengal, sometimes I listen to them, and it's really fascinating how there's some words, especially kind of elemental words, that sound very similar to Polish words, like ogni and ogień, which means fire, right? Or numbers like pięć. In Polish it's pięć, and it means 5. It's so there's all those links very far back that we wouldn't have, we wouldn't think that those things are connected. But when you are interested in mythologies and you start tracing different myths, it's a really interesting exercise, and one could spend a whole life comparing and contrasting.
So let's hear about Mara and Tornev escaping from Homen and what happens.
So here, Tornev in his bear form, because he can shapeshift into a bear, he can hear the Homen coming. I can hear it, Mara. It's coming. Soon you will be able to hear it too, and I can't see any houses nearby, no shelter. Mara chewed on her lip. She looked towards the field. Among the stalks were children, some younger than Mara, some older. Maybe they know to run towards the forest, she said, hope draining from her voice. They're too far. By the time the Homen appears, they won't be able to outrun it, even if they run in a straight line. Then let's go, Mara said. Tornev didn't move. I'm a bear, Mara. If the children see me, how do you think they'll react? You must go alone. Warn them. But the charm won't protect you if you don't stick by me. Mara's eyes opened wide. A faint sound like the wind whistling through the ice holes of Stribok's palace floated on the air. Go, now, Tornev shook Mara off. She rolled off his back to the ground and broke straight into a run. The dry grass under her feet rustled. The last of the summer sun warmed her back, and she settled into a rhythm. The children were playing no more than 100 or so meters away. She could make it. But would they listen to the strange silver-haired child? She steeled herself. The wind changed. A breeze caressed her cheek and carried the first notes of the strange, discordant music. Mara felt the tiny hairs on the nape of her neck stand on end. Would Vila's charm work? She increased her pace. Run! She screamed at the children. 1, 2, there were 5 of them. At least 2 were too young to outrun the Homan if it got too close. The Homan is coming. Run! You need to go to your houses. Go! The children stopped and stared at her. Maybe they too heard the distant screeching, or was it just her? Perhaps the winds bring the sounds to her ears only as a warning for kinship's sake. The oldest child, a dark-haired girl, let the child on her shoulders down and turned west, listening in. It's the Homan! Monsters! Run! Mara was 20 meters away now, and the children watched her with wary expressions. She must have made for quite a spectacle, a blue-skinned, silver-haired child in fine embroidered clothes which were now ragged and too small for her. Would they be frightened of her too? But no. Determination crossed the dark-haired girl's face, and she shouted something to the children in a tongue Mara didn't recognize. The smallest child of the group climbed onto the girl's back, and the others started running east. Come, a boy called out to Mara. Hide with us, it's not far. But Mara just waved to him and turned back towards the forest. She could see a smudge of brown between the white of the birches where Tornef, unprotected, stood in full view. She ran back towards him. She looked up towards the sky, where the clouds rolled lazily by as if there was no Homan, no Cochet. The music got louder now. The screeching filled the air. Mara could see the clouds of dust kicked up in the west by dozens of skeletal feet. The gyrating bodies of the corpses animated by fury. Fury at the living for not being part of the Homan. Fury at the world that allowed them to die in a desire to take all the living with them. Tornef! Mara called out. Bile was rising in her throat from the exertion. Tornef heard her and bounded out of the forest. He was close to her now. Relief washed over her. A triumphant howl pierced the air. They've seen him. Mara reached out a hand to Tornef. Vila had warned them. Whatever veil the charm cast over them, it wouldn't work now. She glanced quickly towards the Homan and then wished she hadn't. The leader of the procession had pulled on the reins of his ghostly horse and pointed one finger at Tornef. The rest of the Homan paused for half a heartbeat before throwing themselves towards the running bear. Some of the skeletal demons ran on 2 legs, and some had fallen onto all 4s and kicked up the dust like a pack of strange hounds. Tornef was closer now, nearly with her. Without slowing down, he lowered his head and rammed into Mara. With a flick, he tossed her onto his back, bruising her ribs and almost making her throw up her breakfast. What are you doing? Turn to the forest. We will lose them there. The children, look! Tornef screamed between pants. And then she saw what he was running towards. One of the children, a little boy too big to be carried, had stumbled in a field and fallen down. His brothers and sisters were now far ahead and couldn't hear his desperate calls over the Homan's music and howls. Mara understood. She flattened herself against Tornef's back and grabbed handfuls of his fur. She felt a sharp pang of guilt when she felt how sunken his sides were. No time to think about it, no time to be scared. They were with the child within moments. The little boy screamed when he saw a bear charging at him, but then a confused expression crossed his face when Mara's face peeked out above Tornef's head. Come, trust me, she screamed. The boy looked at her, then looked towards the fast-approaching Homan and reached a hand out to Mara. Tornef grunted as Mara pulled the boy onto his back and in front of her. Run, Tornef! Tornef, panting loudly, struggled to pick up the pace. Can you run faster? Mara called out. Tornef didn't respond. He stumbled and nearly fell in the grass. The little boy screamed. Mara looked behind him. The procession of the death-bearing corpses was closing in. They were no further than 80 meters away or so. The weight of Mara and the boy was too much. Tornef was slowing down. Mara leaned forward so her mouth was by the boy's ear. Hold on tight and don't let go, no matter what. Then she relaxed her body and let herself fall off Tornef's back. Keep going, Tornef. Don't stop, she shouted, when Tornef made a frightened yelp. She rolled to her feet and ran alongside Tornef, her chest burning and her bruised ribs aching. She ignored the pain. The triumphant howls of the Homan told her plain enough. Vila's charm veil had fallen off, and Cochet's servants could see their prey, and also how slow they were now.
Thank you. I want to come back to this theme of identity, because actually what happens next in your story is really key to identifying, you know, who Tornev is in particular. But there's lots of, you know, you talked a little bit about identity before, about conflicting identity. We've kind of got the theme of ambiguous identity as well, on top of shape-shifting. So as you mentioned, Tornev can shapeshift into the form of a bear. It's not entirely in his control, but he is part bear, part human, and he seems to be quite at ease in that. I mean, Mara comments a couple of times how, you know, she's uncomfortable with her, you know, identity, and yet he seems to be, you know, to shrug it on and shrug it off and actually be quite happy about it. Can I just ask you, do you think identity is fixed? Is it innate? Is it something, you know, is the fact that Tornev is part Botrish, is that something that's, you know, he can shrug off as easily as he might shrug off a bear skin?
I mean, I definitely don't think that there is any part of identity that is innate. I think it's always linked to community, to how we fit into the community, how others see us. So it's a mix of all these things. I mean, we are a product of our environment, and it's a kind of, you know, this old truism, but it's, you know, sometimes we fit better into the environment, sometimes we don't fit in as well. And for Tornev, you know, he grew up only knowing his father, only knowing the Prisani culture. But because his mother was Botrish, and I mean, you know, Botrish people in the Storm Child are kind of based on obviously the Romani tribes that lived in sort of Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine, and how they sort of fit. Because of his mixed heritage, because he was visibly different from the other children in the village, he faced a lot of discrimination. He was ostracized, and he felt quite powerless in that. And in Mara, who also had this sort of dual identity and that dual heritage in her, albeit not human. He felt a sense of kinship, and you know, her struggles with who she was sort of mirrored his struggles as well. And for me, this idea of, you know, like when he was given this option to become a shapeshifter, to be able to change into a bear, that was the first time that he felt an inkling of power, that he felt in control. Because you know, when you spend your whole life being powerless and being an outsider, then you might no longer fear being an outsider, but to have that sense of control over yourself and how you look, and, you know, to be strong and powerful, that is an incredibly appealing prospect, and it was so for Tornev. So, you know, for him, changing into a bear is basically about, you know, he's gaining power, he's gaining control, you know, he feels safe as a bear. But it's not so easy when it comes to being accepted into communities. So, you know, over the course of the Storm Child, you know, the children that Mara and Tornev save are actually Botrish children who are traveling with Mama Bohina. Mama Bohina is basically this matriarchal sort of character who looks after orphaned children or abandoned Botrish children. And they have a sort of traveling show with Mama Bohina. There were a few, at a sort of time that I'm describing in the book, there were a few professions that were open to people of sort of Romani descent. And in Prisan as well, there are only like a list of, there's a short list of professions that are available to Romani people, including, you know, silver work, for example. So, so she looks after these children, and when she sees Tornif, and when she sees, that he is clearly, at least partially, of Botrish heritage, she feels this need to sort of bring him into the community. She sees that, culturally, he doesn't have anything of the kind of Botrish side, but she wants to bring him in. She wants to introduce him to those traditions. And to an extent, she sees Mara as an obstacle to that.
I think, it's really interesting to look at this as, someone who works within the book industry. You as a writer, me as a bookseller, many of the people, watching may well be publishing students or teachers and bloggers, and that we have a lot of discussion about identity. And I feel that, that one of the great unspokens is how much that is about the way you look, your appearance. I mean, I don't look Moroccan, I don't look like I'm from North Africa, but, and I was brought up, with one side of my family, just being very conscious through a few subtle remarks that I didn't quite look enough like that side of the family. And then for the other side of the family, there was clearly something other about me as well. So it's not that I was rejected by both sides of the family, but I think you do end up with this sense that you don't quite belong in one or the other, rather than that you belong in both. And I just think, we've got that in both of these children here. We've got that in Tornif, in that Mama Bohina, she almost immediately, once he's transformed back into a boy, she looks at him and she says, your skin is, the wrong color, but, the rest of it looks right. I can tell that you're part of my kin. So it is entirely about his appearance once she can see who he is. And with Mara as well, is that when we meet her in the Storm Child, she has completely transformed in the way she looks. She suddenly looks like the half of her which is God, and not the half of her which is human. She has blue skin, she has silver hair. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, about the way that, we all look, the way that, we look, and how we relate to those identities when that happens.
Yeah, I think for various sort of historical and cultural reasons, many people feel a very deep-rooted need to define what you look like if you belong to a certain ethnic group or a certain community. And it's because of how humans have evolved, because of how national borders were drawn up, and it's through sort of various means. It's rarely that straightforward, and it's leading us at the moment, especially I see on social media, towards very kind of toxic. I hesitate to call that conversation, because a conversation suggests that there's some back and forth and an exchange of ideas rather than trying to shout people down. But you see it all the time, where people who are light skinned, but they're mixed race, but they came out light skinned, and they get their heritage sort of refused them. So basically, if they dress in the traditional clothes of their parents, they get accused of, I don't know, cultural appropriation or something, which is, it's,
yeah, I've had exactly that. Yeah, I've had exactly that with, not being allowed to. So I was brought up with the Arabian Nights, as a story, which I'd love to illustrate, and I've had people question whether, a white English woman should be illustrating the Arabian Nights. But as my grandmother, said, I am part of Morocco's story. I might, be white with, lighter color hair, but I am part of that story.
I think, any attempt to curtail people's sort of creativity or exploration in this way is very anti-intellectual. It's just, it's philosophically and ethically vapid, to be honest. It's not, because it's, they are not questioning their own, prejudices about what a person of this heritage should look like. They just sort of, so they put on their prejudices on you in a way, and but I, honestly, I feel like anybody who should be able to explore anything artistically. I mean, that's the point of artistic expression, isn't it? push boundaries, to learn, to express yourself, and to express all the sort of all your passions and interests. And I think it's, we should be talking more about, bringing all those different influences in, and that it's all human, it all belongs to us. And I think that is a far more productive conversation. I think that is a far more progressive, form of sort of discussing those things, because when you try to divide heritages and you try to divide cultures in this way, that it's really racist way to divide a people, isn't it?
It feels very false as well when we're all so mixed heritage. And I think, I think it's what as being anti-intellectual, I find a lot of that discussion is quite anti-creative too, which, and actually I love the idea that we could have a book which brings in, characters, or fairy type characters or ghost type characters, from a range of different cultures, and actually puts them together, because that is who we are. We, when we move countries, second generation, we don't leave our ghosts and our fairy folk behind us. We bring them with us. They travel alongside us, then, as do our stories. Can I talk about one of the other themes in the book, which I felt really strong, which I think is connected, which is that of empathy, which I know is looked at, a lot in schools. There's a lot of, for example, when Mara is trying to understand, and for a long time failing to understand, how her apparently ice cold mother, doesn't express, any emotion or any need for her. She doesn't feel like her mother needs her in any way at all. And, she identifies this as because she's a god, she's a different race. Her sense of time is different, all these things. So she's trying to understand how a god might express emotion, if you know what I mean. So, which is a fairly extreme example of trying to find an empathic route to understand somebody better or a culture better. Could you talk a little bit about that theme in the book, and how that's woven throughout the storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, I think humans are, unfortunately, we're very good at communicating within our very narrowly understood communities, but our communities have expanded in such a tremendous way, and humans are unfortunately also pretty dreadful at understanding each other across different cultures and communities, because we're trying to superimpose our own kind of codified, not just language, but the sort of set of signals, the non-verbal signals, the small customs. We are trying to superimpose it on people from different cultures, different countries, different communities within our own country, and misunderstandings arise very quickly. And you see it a lot online, where people from different countries try to judge someone's expression or someone's behavior based on their own understanding of what's right, what's wrong, how we should interact. And those misunderstandings would be comical if they didn't carry such a sort of heavy emotional toll on people. And in that sense, developing empathy is so important, because it makes us pause. It makes us, it makes us stop ourselves from jumping to conclusions about someone's intent, and trying to put maybe a kinder spin on someone's intent. And it's a very difficult thing to do, because it's more immediately rewarding, unfortunately, to put a negative spin on how people think, and to sort of ascribe to them more negative qualities. It's a kind of, I think maybe to an extent, it's a self-defense mechanism. It's we also sometimes build communities over negative feelings, which is not very healthy way to go about it, in my view. But in the Storm Child and the Wind Child, I was trying to kind of show this, there's all those different family members of both Tornev and Mara, who their behavior is jarring, either on us as a reader or on Mara, or on Tornif. But as you sort of read on, you see the intention is pure. The intention is, it comes from a place of kindness, even though those sort of cultural markers do not translate for the person who's a sort of a recipient of a certain type of attention. And when we sort of pause and try to understand each other a bit more, the result is, far more positive. And, when it comes to Mara's parents, because her father's affection is of a particular, type, he is human, but he's also a very warm human being. He's a kind of person who is, he's very tactile with her. He, affirms her verbally. He sort of praises her. He shows her affection in this way, and so she leans into that. And so her mother, who, is not perhaps capable of doing that. Her mother doesn't have that tactile side to her. She doesn't hug Mara. She doesn't praise her. She doesn't, show those same signs of affection. And so from Mara's perspective, her mother has no affection for her. So, which is, of course, from a child's perspective, it's very difficult to expect a child to try and interpret those markers in a more sort of favorable light. But I hope that for readers, we can sort of question it a little bit more, and think about how would an immortal, godlike being interpret affection. How would they express it? How would, again, like you touched on the sort of question of time, they have, like, an immortal being has all the time in the world to come to certain conclusions, to express themselves. They don't have that sense of immediacy that humans do. And that would, in my imagination, that would kind of influence how they express themselves, because they don't have that urgency to them. And as humans, we often expect a certain sense of urgency. We want to be told that we're loved now. From Tornif's perspective as well, when he's introduced to this sort of Botrishkin, he doesn't understand them, they don't understand him. And I think their demand that he be incorporated into their community, and that he sort of lets himself become his true Botrish self, is impossible for him to achieve, especially in a time frame that they expected in. And so he kind of rebels against it. So I think that brings it back as well to this concept of having multiple identities, multiple heritages. And we all have multiple heritages and identities, we just don't know about them, I suppose. But it's about being able to claim all of it, and being able to say, you know what, this is mine too. This belongs to me too. I can access this. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Can I change track a little bit, because there's so much in here. There's so much, of the folklore, of the mythology, and I'm aware that all of this discussion, as well as the comparative mythology that we've touched on. These are the stories that have a way of holding their shape across cultures and things. So when we've got those, perhaps clashes of communication or elements of misunderstanding storytelling and the use of a story, I think particularly in the context, of a child reading, or a parent reading to a child, can often really break those down. I just want to talk a little bit about you as a writer. So with all of this stuff that's going on, all of these themes, all of these stories that are weaving around, What is your process for writing them down? So, you know, for those who are watching who may be, you know, keen to write themselves or keen to understand how you translate your own heritage into, you know, storytelling, how you get it across for the English child or perhaps the Polish child who's been brought up in England, you know, what's your process? Where do you start?
So, you know, when I started getting interested in sort of Slavic mythology, I have a very magpie-like approach. I just sort of pick out the shiny bits. But it's, I was reading the sort of old Slavic stories, you know, but they're for children mostly. And I found it interesting, like, you know, especially like reading multiple versions of the same story. How an add-on, so you have the, you know, the kind of pre-Christian traditions in Slavic mythology, and then you have a sort of Christian add-ons or changes, and sometimes you get two versions of the same story, but one has this sort of purpose of trying to convince people to move away from the old way of being. And, you know, having always been interested in different world mythologies, it's I go into it with this desire to sort of compare and contrast. And then, you know, because the sort of the mythologies and the folkloric stories, they show us the values of a society, and they show us what was important for those people. And like in a lot of sort of pre-Christian Slavic mythologies, I found that empathy is a very valued sort of characteristic in a hero. It's something that, for example, I did not see in Norse mythology. Like being able to empathize with someone who is different than us is not valued. It's and, you know, it might be that the value of a society that, you know, builds its wealth on raiding is, you know, being able to empathize with the other is not, you know, would not be desirable in the same way. Whereas in sort of pre-Christian, specifically Slavic mythology, it's very important to be able to understand even the spirits that are sort of ambivalent towards humanity, to understand their motivation, that this is their sort of sphere, right? Like the creatures that protect the forest, it's not that they hate us necessarily, but they're protecting the forest. So how do we interact with them in a way that's respectful and, you know, hopefully gets us what we want, but without overstepping the boundaries? And you know, even in the sort of one version of the Strzyga myth, the Strzyga is sort of kind of like vampiric style monster. You can be a Strzyga because you're cursed, or you can be a Strzyga because you were born a Strzyga. So it's different versions of it. But in a bit, in the story I'm talking about, the main character releases the Strzyga from the curse by climbing into her tomb and taking on and feeling her pain. So he sort of, the hero, you know, there's this horrifying monster that eats humans outside of the tomb, and he feels her pain, and he feels her loneliness, and her, you know, that she's scared, and that she's isolated, and he takes it on. He sort of brings it into himself, and when he does that, the curse is broken, and the Strzyga becomes a girl again. And you know, so I'm trying to sort of pick out, when I read Slavic stories, I try and look at it with this angle of what is the value, what's the feel of the story, but what's the value that is represented in the story. And and that sort of inspires me, because of course the Storm Child and the Wind Child, they're inspired by Slavic mythology, right? So, you know, there's some gods that I completely make up. You know, there's certain elements that are just, you know, they're not authentic. They're authentic in the feel I like to feel. I like to feel, I like to make sure. They're authentic in the feel of it, and in the values, I hope. But not, you know, they're not literally sort of pulled from a story necessarily.
That's really interesting. So, you know, actually the importance of, you know, getting the feel of it right, the values behind it right, you know, in terms of the quality of the accuracy as a writer, is more important to convey than the correct name of this god or their appearance. Before we end, I'm just conscious of time. I would really just like to talk about images a little bit, if that's okay. Both you and I are illustrators as well as other jobs we do, and I know that the students at UCLan and any teachers watching, and any bloggers will also be really interested in things like the cover design for the book, and how books are illustrated, how those images come about, what those characters look like. So I'm just going to do a quick shout out to the amazing Alexis Snell, who is the wonderful printmaker who created this book. And if you look inside, it's really got these sort of glorious chapter openings that go all the way through the book, so you really do have this sense that you're almost walking into a forest of a book. I wondered if you'd be able to just pick out a few images of some of the characters in your book, not necessarily ones that you've done, maybe some traditional, maybe some of your own, and actually just one by one just talk us through those images and show us what these characters look like, because I think that's incredible. It's a very visual sort of book, even though it's beyond the illuminations, let's call them that. It's not an illustrated book, but there's quite a lot of powerful visual elements to your writing. I think that's fair to say.
So I just wanted to also say that Alexis now has really captured this traditional cutout or woodcut print style that is very much present in sort of different Slavic folkloric art traditions. So I think her art is absolutely amazing in capturing that. It's a kind of simplicity, but almost like a brutalist aspect of it. So amazing. Are we going to show the images?
I think we'll show the images and we'll edit them in. So I think if you just talk us through, if you pick out maybe 3 or 4 images and just talk us through those and describe what we're seeing, I think then the amazing team at UCLan can edit them in for those who are watching.
So first, I want to talk about the Koshchei the Deathless and the image by Ivan Bilibin. So Ivan Bilibin was a Russian artist, sort of end of 19th, beginning of 20th century, who was collecting stories and illustrating traditional Russian stories. And a lot of folkloric sort of traditions overlap between different Slavic nations, even if the characters are called different things. So here we have this glorious old naked man writing with a sword, and he is trying to capture the hero of a story in this, and he is riding on his sort of man-eating horse. This you see is a kind of fun framing on the image that is a very typical sort of turn of the 19th, 20th century style in the sort of Eastern Europe. There was a very active sort of nation building exercise and sort of art forming exercise of trying to create a national sort of sense of identity through art. And I think Ivan Bilibin's sort of style really captures that. Then I'm going to show Homen. It's an image from the book on sort of mythological creatures by Witold Vargas and Paweł Zich, who sort of also illustrated it. And you see this sort of frightening looking image of the skeletal procession. It's like Tamsin sort of mentioned, it's quite sort of reminiscent of sort of the Wild Hunt and all those different sort of folkloric stories from different parts of the world. The Homen in Eastern Europe, it sort of symbolizes the plague, really, and this very fast sort of spread of diseases that you have to hide from. So it's a very visual, it's a very visual sort of way of representing something that people are scared of. And there's a couple of my illustrations that one again that I just sort of I did those illustrations for my own pleasure, and as one of Mara and Tornif running from home. And yeah, so that's it.
Thank you very much indeed. And can I just remind everybody that please do make sure you're following UClan, across social media as well, because they're sharing, there's some great storytelling coming out of UClan. Speaking as a bookseller, it's really fantastic to see books like this. Autumn Moonbeam is another one that actually just brings in completely different elements that we don't see too often. We've got a whole cast of autistic characters in that, written by an autistic writer, which is again a fantastic addition. What else has come out from UClan recently? The Weather Weaver series has come out from UClan, so make sure you're following them on social media as well, and also have a look at Gabriela's own social media accounts, and I think you've got a separate art account as well if people want to look at you as an artist as well as a writer. Do look her up, and Alexis Snell as well has a fantastic Instagram page, so please do go and look at their print work, because it's really, really stunning. So Gabriela, thank you very, very much, and I'd also just like to say a huge thank you to UClan for recording this, for bringing us together, I think, in the first place. Yeah, please do contact any of us with any observations or questions or anything that you'd like to really add to this conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tamsin.